The hum of Logan International Airport was punctuated by the hurried steps of passengers, all eager to get to their gates and board their flights. The usual hustle of travelers with luggage, bright signs overhead, and the steady whir of rolling suitcases filled the space. But for James Lawson, today felt different. As he walked through the terminal, he felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders. A senior captain with nearly 2 decades of experience, James had seen it all. From the quiet mornings of takeoff to the noisy rush of a full flight, there was a precision required for every moment in the cockpit. Today's flight was routine, a cross-country journey to Los Angeles. But the moment he stepped into the terminal, something felt off, like the air had thickened, pressing down on him. He hadn't even reached his gate when he noticed a police officer standing just ahead, scanning the crowd with cold, calculating eyes. As James approached, the officer's gaze flickered toward him. And in that instant, James knew something was wrong. The officer's posture stiffened, his hands resting firmly on the holster of his belt. "Excuse me, sir. Do you mind stepping aside for a moment?" The officer's voice was sharp, his tone cutting through the ambient noise of the terminal like a knife. James paused, taken aback. The officer's words were clipped, his demeanor less than professional. He glanced around, the unease creeping into his chest. "Was there something wrong? Is something the matter?" James asked, keeping his voice steady despite the unsettling knot forming in his stomach. His eyes shifted briefly to his small badge, the only sign that he belonged here. Yet it seemed to do nothing to ease the officer's suspicion. The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step closer, scanning James with a look of disdain. The scrutiny was enough to make anyone uncomfortable. But James fought to maintain his composure. "What exactly are you doing here?" The officer's voice raised, attracting the attention of nearby passengers. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "You don't look like you belong here." James furrowed his brows, confusion slowly turning to frustration. He had seen this before, the subtle but ever-present suspicion that followed him like a shadow wherever he went. He reached for his ID, hoping a simple clarification would end the ordeal. Before he could even touch his pocket, the officer's eyes hardened, and his voice dropped, almost threatening. "Hands where I can see them. Now." The words were a sharp command. And before James could respond, the officer's gaze pierced through him, demanding compliance. A few people in the crowd gasped. The air felt heavy, charged with judgment and expectation. James froze, his hand still hovering near his jacket pocket. It wasn't fear, he'd faced worse, but there was something about this moment. This feeling of being instantly presumed guilty, that stung in a way he wasn't prepared for. "Sir, please," James said, his voice calm, but the frustration was creeping in. "Let me show you my credentials. I'm supposed to be here." "Oh, is that right?" The officer sneered, folding his arms in front of him as if James had just presented a weak excuse. "You think that little plastic badge gives you the right to be here?" He scoffed, looking down at the small airline ID pinned to James's jacket. "People like you, always trying to sneak in where you don't belong." The words cut deeper than he expected, each one a silent accusation. James's heart pounded, a mixture of anger and humiliation rising inside him. But he fought to keep it in check. He had earned his place here, a place that wasn't given easily. He had fought for every ounce of respect. But today, none of that seemed to matter to this officer. "I'm not here to cause trouble," James said, keeping his voice steady. "I'm a captain for this flight. I've been cleared through all the proper channels." He gestured subtly toward the gate, trying to signal that he had nothing to hide. The officer didn't seem convinced. He stood taller, his eyes narrowing. "I don't care who you are," he spat, his words laced with contempt. "Step aside, or I'll call for backup. You don't belong here." The crowd around them had begun to watch, some curious, some with pity in their eyes, but none willing to challenge the officer's authority. It was as if they had already decided, this man, standing in front of James, was right, and James, by default, was wrong. James felt the weight of their eyes on him, the silent judgment, and yet, something inside him remained resolute. He had fought too hard for his career, his position, He wasn't going to let this officer dictate his worth. He took a deep breath and stepped back slightly. Not in submission, but in acceptance of the fact that this encounter was inevitable. Fine, he said, his voice low but firm. But soon, you'll understand exactly where I belong. The officer's smirk grew, clearly believing he had won this small victory. He turned his back to James and strode away, his posture triumphant, as if expecting applause from the onlookers. But James knew better. He knew this wasn't the end of it, not by a long shot. As James stood there, watching the officer retreat, he couldn't shake the sting of the moment. The crowd, the whispers, the assumptions, they all haunted him. But as the boarding process continued and passengers moved toward the gate, he reminded himself that in the end, none of that mattered. The true power dynamics were about to shift. Soon, the officer would learn that respect wasn't granted based on a uniform or a badge. It was earned, and James had already earned his. This was just the beginning. The hallway leading to the gate felt strangely narrow, like the walls themselves were closing in on James. He could feel the sharp edges of judgment still biting at him. Even as the passengers moved past, their hurried footsteps echoing in the terminal, each step felt like a weight. The tension of the encounter with Officer Ryan Williams hanging over him like a cloud. James adjusted his jacket, his fingers brushing against the small airline badge pinned neatly on his lapel. It was a simple thing, but today it felt like an anchor, a symbol of all the hard work, dedication, and sacrifice that had gone unnoticed by so many. His mind replayed the officer's words, the sneering contempt in his tone. People like you, always trying to sneak in where you don't belong. He could still feel the sting of those words, searing through him with every passing second. He took a deep breath, pushing the frustration down. There was no room for anger now. No room for anything but focus. He had a flight to board, passengers to guide, lives to ensure safety for. That's what mattered, right? But before he could make it to the gate, he saw him again, Officer Williams, now standing at the edge of the crowd. Watching him, the officer's posture was rigid, his eyes locked onto James, as though he was waiting for a reason to pounce. The moment James stepped closer to the boarding area, Williams moved forward, his footsteps deliberate. A wave of unease washed over James. But he didn't let it show. He'd spent years learning to control his reactions, to keep his composure in situations like this, even when every nerve in his body screamed to lash out. Hold on, Williams said, his voice low but carrying a sharp edge. I'm going to need you to step aside for a more thorough check. James's stomach tightened. He knew where this was going. He could feel it in his bones. This wasn't about procedure anymore. This was about power, his authority being challenged in a way that felt all too familiar. The officer's gaze was like a spotlight, searing through him, trying to find something, anything, that would justify the scrutiny. I've already shown you my ID. James replied calmly, his voice firm but controlled. There's no need for this. Williams didn't flinch. That badge doesn't mean anything to me, he said, his voice colder now. I need to make sure you're not pulling something. You might think you've got it all figured out, but you don't belong here. A lump formed in James's throat, but he swallowed it down. His pride and dignity were being tested in ways that words could never describe. The officer's tone was thick with an assumption that James was nothing more than an imposter. Someone who hadn't earned his place in the world. And to make matters worse, the other passengers were starting to notice. He could feel their eyes on him, their gazes flicking back and forth between him and the officer, as though waiting for a scene to unfold. Sir, I'm a captain for this flight, James said, holding his ground. I'm supposed to be here. I've been cleared through all the proper channels. But Williams wasn't listening. His eyes narrowed as he scanned James again, like a hawk circling its prey. Right, he scoffed. And I'm supposed to believe that? Huh? Just because you say so? The humiliation of it hit harder than anything he'd ever felt. This wasn't just an inconvenience, this was a personal attack. It was as if everything he had worked for, every hour spent honing his craft, every obstacle he'd overcome, meant nothing in this moment. Step aside, the officer insisted, his voice rising, or I'll call for backup. James's hands curled into fists at his sides, but he kept his composure. He could feel his heart racing, the adrenaline beginning to surge. But he didn't let it break through. He had spent too many years building this reputation, this trust in his ability to remain calm under pressure. "I'm not going anywhere," James said firmly, his voice low but resolute. "If you want to call backup, go ahead, but you'll soon see that I'm not the one who's in the wrong here." For a moment, the officer seemed to hesitate, as if unsure of how to proceed. Then, with a dismissive wave, he stepped aside, allowing James to pass, but not before delivering one last, cutting remark. "You'll see, Captain," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're going to regret this." James didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew that, in that moment, he had won something far more important than just this confrontation. The crowd, the passengers, had watched. They had seen the officer's assumptions, his prejudice, his refusal to listen, and James, with his quiet dignity, had stood firm. As he finally approached the gate, he could feel a shift in the air. There were no more whispers, no more curious glances. Instead, there was a sense of quiet respect, as if the passengers had finally understood something they hadn't before. But as he stepped onto the plane, his thoughts weren't entirely settled. He knew this wasn't the end of it. There would be more battles to fight. The officer, Officer Williams, wasn't done with him yet. But neither was James. The sky was waiting, and in that cockpit, where he truly belonged, James Lawson would find his peace. For now, anyway. The moment James Lawson stepped into the cockpit, the world outside seemed to fall away. The soft hum of the engines, the rhythmic blinking of the gauges, the familiar weight of the controls beneath his hands, it was all he needed to focus. This was his element. This was where he belonged. The door clicked shut behind him, cutting off the rest of the airport. The judgmental stares, and the whispered conversations of passengers still lingering in the terminal. As the cockpit lights blinked on, James exhaled, his body relaxing. If only just. "You all right, Captain?" Ethan Harper, his co-pilot, glanced over with an easy smile, though there was a hint of concern in his eyes. James gave a tight nod. But his mind was elsewhere, replaying the earlier incident with Officer Williams. That sense of humiliation still clung to him like a second skin. But here in the cockpit, he could control his environment. He could let the world spin around him, while he maintained focus on the job at hand. It wasn't easy. His hands still felt slightly clammy, the tension in his jaw stubbornly persistent. But he had a job to do. "I'm fine," James replied, his voice neutral, though the words didn't come as easily as they should have. "Just a little turbulence on the ground," he added, offering a reassuring smile, hoping Ethan wouldn't press further. Ethan seemed to buy the answer, though James could tell his co-pilot wasn't fully convinced. Ethan was a good man, smart, dependable, and someone who had earned James's trust in countless flights over the years. They'd flown together enough to understand when something was off. But Ethan, like everyone else in the crew, knew better than to ask too many questions when James put on that calm exterior. The pre-flight checklist was smooth and uneventful, the instruments ticking off as they should. James knew this flight like the back of his hand, and as they taxied toward the runway, the tension in his shoulders slowly began to ease. His eyes flicked to the runway ahead, the clear blue sky stretching out beyond the horizon. Soon, they would be airborne, and with the weight of the world beneath them, James could leave the ground and his frustrations behind. But just as the plane roared to life and began its ascent, a strange thought crept into his mind, one he couldn't shake. "Officer Williams." James gripped the yoke, his knuckles whitening slightly. What would it take to make people like him see beyond their assumptions? To make them understand that he wasn't here by mistake, that he had earned his place? A soft chime from the intercom broke his train of thought. "Captain, we've got an issue at the gate," came the voice of the head flight attendant. "It's from Airport Security Officer Williams is requesting to speak with you." James's jaw clenched. Of course, the officer would make an appearance now. He could feel his heartbeat quicken, the familiar rush of adrenaline surging through him once again. His first instinct was to push back, to demand that Williams come to him, to make him apologize. But he knew better. He had too much to lose. The passengers on this flight depended on him to be in control. And the moment he let his frustration spill over, it would be just another strike against him. Understood, James replied curtly, and with a steadying breath. He clicked off the intercom. The remainder of the climb into the sky was uneventful. But for James, the tension in his chest was anything but. Officer Williams hadn't won yet. Not by a long shot. The rest of the flight passed in a blur of calculated motions. The rhythmic hum of the engines was a lullaby in his ears. But the encounter with Officer Williams, and the weight of being constantly judged, stayed with him. James knew that this wasn't just about one officer at one airport. This was a symptom of something far deeper. A prejudice that ran through the veins of a system, built on assumptions and biases. It was the quiet sting of judgment he'd felt countless times before. From the airport to the cockpit, to the passengers who walked by him without a second glance. He couldn't help but think, when did it become necessary to prove your worth to the world? Every single day? Why did it have to be a battle just to exist? To do your job, to be respected for what you brought to the table? Captain, Ethan said again, his voice breaking through James's spiraling thoughts. We're about an hour out from LA. Everything looking good on your end? James blinked, refocusing on the controls. The autopilot was holding steady. The altitude was perfect, and there was no turbulence on the radar. Yeah, we're clear, just keeping an eye on the weather. James answered, his voice calm again. Ethan nodded, satisfied, but James could see the lingering concern in his eyes. James didn't blame him for being concerned. He was concerned too. About everything. About how long he could keep suppressing the weight of it all. How long he could keep his cool in the face of every subtle insult and indignity. The cabin behind them was calm. Passengers chatting or reading, blissfully unaware of the tension that had unfolded just a few hours earlier. James couldn't help but envy their peace. To them, he was just another captain. Another professional doing his job. But for him, it was never that simple. As the plane leveled out over the sprawling expanse of the Pacific, James's mind returned once again to the officer. The encounter hadn't been resolved. Not in his mind, not by a long shot. He knew that he would face more moments like this. More moments of being questioned. More assumptions to fight off. But as he glanced at Ethan, sitting beside him, and then back at the instruments before him, he knew one thing with certainty: no one, not Officer Williams. Not anyone, could take away the respect he had earned. Not in the sky, not on the ground, not now, and not ever. He took a deep breath, allowing himself one moment of reprieve. The fight wasn't over, but for now, as the hum of the engines continued to carry them across the skies, he was flying, and that, for now, was enough. The seatbelt sign flickered off, and the soft hum of the engines settled into a low purr as the plane cruised smoothly across the sky. James Lawson's hands, steady on the controls, relaxed a fraction. There was a calm that came with flying, an inviolable sense of purpose. A rhythm that helped him forget the tension from the airport, if only for a moment. He exhaled deeply, the quiet satisfaction of a successful flight still swirling around him. But that peace was shattered by a sharp, crackling sound coming through the intercom. Captain Lawson, we've just received a request from airport security. The voice of the head flight attendant came through, laced with hesitance. It's Officer Ryan Williams. He's asking to speak with you, sir. James's grip tightened on the yoke, though his expression remained unchanged. He had known it was coming. Of course, the officer couldn't let it go. He hadn't had enough. It was clear that the moment James stepped off the plane, there would be a reckoning. And now, it seemed, it was time. Understood, James replied, his voice flat, but his heart quickening. He switched off the intercom with a steady hand, turning to Ethan Harper, his co-pilot, who was watching him with an expression of concern. You okay, Captain? Ethan asked quietly, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. I'll be fine, James replied, his voice low but resolute. Just a little, unfinished business. Ethan nodded, but his eyes remained on James, studying him for a moment. Don't let him get under your skin, he said softly. You've earned your place here, no matter what anyone says. James gave a small nod, but his mind was already elsewhere. It wasn't just Officer Williams. It was the constant assumption that people like him didn't belong. That no matter how many years he'd spent in the cockpit, how many miles he'd flown, how many lives he'd safely delivered to their destinations, he was still seen as an outsider. The cabin was quiet, passengers settling into their seats, oblivious to the confrontation brewing behind the scenes. James tried to focus on the flight, to drown out the noise in his head. But the anticipation of the inevitable encounter gnawed at him. After what felt like an eternity, the announcement for final descent crackled through the speakers. The plane began its descent into Los Angeles, the city sprawling beneath them. James's mind, however, was far from the beautiful sunset painting the horizon. He could feel the weight of Officer Williams's request pressing against him, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Just before they hit the final descent phase, the intercom crackled once more. "Captain Lawson," the voice came through, softer now. "Officer Williams is waiting for you at the gate. He requests your presence." A wave of frustration washed over James. The officer couldn't be serious. He was just a passenger on this flight, nothing more. Yet here he was, wielding his power like a weapon. The fact that this situation was being forced upon him left a bitter taste in James's mouth. He glanced at Ethan again. "This won't be pretty," James muttered. Ethan gave a silent nod and turned back to the controls, not pressing further. James didn't need advice now, he needed clarity. He needed to see this through. When the plane touched down, the usual roar of the engines quieted, and the inevitable tension hung heavy in the air. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, James's thoughts swirled, but his hands remained steady. He wasn't going to let anyone shake him. Not now. Not after everything he'd fought for. James stood up from his seat, his legs stiff as he moved toward the cockpit door. He could feel the curious gazes of the flight attendants and passengers on him as he exited the cockpit. But he didn't flinch. The door to the terminal loomed ahead, and behind it, Officer Williams waited. As he approached, he saw him, Officer Williams, standing tall in his uniform, his posture rigid, his face unreadable. He looked like a man who had been expecting this moment all day. He stood there, arms crossed, a cold smirk on his lips. "Captain Lawson," Officer Williams said, his voice oozing with thinly veiled sarcasm. "I was wondering when we'd get this chance to talk. I must admit, I'm a little surprised to see you here." James didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, facing the officer, measuring him. The crowd around them had already begun to notice. They whispered among themselves, wondering what was going on. Who was right? Who was wrong? James forced himself to take a breath, steadying himself. "I'm here because I earned my place," he said, his voice calm, but there was a firmness beneath it. "What's this about, officer?" "Oh, it's simple," Williams replied, his smirk widening. "You see, back at the gate, I had a gut feeling about you. People like you, they don't belong in places like this. You're just another guy with a badge pretending to be something you're not." The words hit harder than James expected, but he didn't let them show. Instead, he met the officer's gaze, unflinching. "I don't need your approval," James said, his tone sharp now, cutting through the air between them. "But what I do need is for you to step aside and let me do my job." Williams's smirk faltered, just for a moment. He didn't expect this kind of response. He had anticipated James being defensive, maybe apologetic, even submissive. But here James stood, unwavering, refusing to be rattled. "You think you can just waltz in here and claim authority?" Williams shot back, his voice rising, but he couldn't hide the hesitation in his eyes. "This isn't your world, Captain. You don't get to call the shots." "I've been calling shots for years," James replied, his voice steady, calm. "And unlike you, I've earned my place here. Every day. So you can either step aside and let me finish this flight, or we can take this conversation somewhere more official." The tension between them was palpable. A battle of wills, of assumptions being shattered and egos on the line. The crowd around them was beginning to murmur again, the energy shifting as the power dynamics started to tilt in James's favor. For a moment, neither man moved. The officer's pride was bruised, his authority questioned in a way that left him floundering, unsure of how to continue. His eyes darted between James and the surrounding passengers, his posture stiffening. But the people around him weren't backing him up. They had seen it, they knew what had happened. And then, a voice cut through the thick silence. Enough. It was a woman's voice. Strong, clear, and unapologetic. She stepped forward, the crowd parting as she did. I was on that flight. She continued, her eyes locking onto Officer Williams. And I saw what happened. You have no right to treat anyone like that. The officer turned toward her, his expression shifting, but she didn't back down. I've flown with Captain Lawson several times. He's one of the best pilots I've ever had. The way you treated him? It's disgraceful. The crowd seemed to breathe as one, their silent approval hanging in the air like a weight. James glanced at the woman, gratitude flickering across his face. The passengers were speaking up now, their support for him building. The officer's face flushed, his smirk finally dropping. He had lost control. This isn't over, he muttered, but his voice was smaller now. Unsure. James stood his ground, meeting the officer's gaze with a quiet finality. It is over, he said softly, for now, at least. But if you want to make it a bigger issue, I'm ready. With a final, frustrated glance, Officer Williams turned and walked away, leaving James standing tall, his dignity restored by the support of those around him. As the crowd began to disperse, murmuring amongst themselves, James took a deep breath. The moment was his. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But tonight, for the first time in a while, James Lawson felt like he had truly won. The plane began its descent into Los Angeles, the gentle hum of the engines grounding James in the present. But his mind was elsewhere. Officer Ryan Williams, the same officer who had accosted him earlier, was now waiting for him at the gate. James knew that the moment the plane landed, his day would be far from over. The thought of facing Williams again, after everything that had transpired, sent a surge of frustration through him. But there was nothing to do but finish the flight and then deal with it. As the plane glided smoothly toward the runway, James adjusted his uniform, his fingers pressing against the familiar fabric of the sleeves. There was comfort in the routine of flying, in the precision of each movement. But the weight of the earlier encounter still clung to him, the sting of the officer's assumptions gnawing at his thoughts. Everything looking good on your end? Ethan Harper, his co-pilot, asked, glancing at James as they prepared for landing. James nodded, his face betraying little. Yeah, everything's fine. Just a little turbulence. Nothing we can't handle. The words came out calm. But beneath them, the undercurrent of tension remained. As they touched down and taxied toward the gate, James could feel his pulse quicken. He had faced storms in the air. But this was different. This wasn't turbulence he could navigate. This was something far more personal. The plane came to a stop. The soft click of the seatbelt sign echoing in the cabin. The usual buzz of passengers unbuckling and gathering their things filled the air. But James barely noticed. His mind was fixed on what was waiting for him at the gate. Officer Williams. The cabin crew made their final checks. The attendants' voices soughed over the intercom. But none of it reached James. He was already up, moving toward the cockpit door. His steps purposeful. Ethan's concerned gaze followed him. You sure you're all right, Captain? Ethan asked quietly, knowing James well enough to sense something was off. James gave a tight smile, forcing his shoulders to relax. Yeah, just business to take care of. Ethan didn't push further, but there was a silent understanding between them. As James stepped into the terminal, the usual cacophony of airport sounds greeted him, the shuffle of feet, the murmur of voices, the click of luggage wheels. But today, the noise felt distant, muffled. He spotted Officer Williams almost immediately. The man stood by the gate, arms crossed, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the crowd like a predator. When their gazes met, the officer's lips curled into a tight smile. The kind of smile James knew too well. It wasn't a smile of greeting, it was a smile of conquest. Williams had been waiting for this moment, and he was clearly relishing it. James's jaw tightened, but he didn't let his anger show. Instead, he walked toward the officer with the same calm determination he had used to get through every other challenge in his career. Captain Lawson, Williams said, his voice dripping with a layer of mock respect. Did you enjoy your flight? James's gaze was unwavering as he responded. What's this about, officer? We already went through this at the gate. Williams took a slow step forward, his eyes narrowing. Oh, this is just me making sure that someone like you is where he's supposed to be. I don't think anyone should get special treatment around here. James didn't flinch. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, officer, and I've earned the right to be here. Williams's smirk only grew. Earned it? Funny, because from where I'm standing, you don't belong here. The words were laced with so much disdain it was almost palpable. The tension in the air thickened, the crowd around them beginning to take notice. James could feel the eyes on him, some curious, some judgmental, but he wasn't going to back down. Not this time, not for someone like Williams. I belong here, James said, his voice low but filled with conviction. You don't get to decide that. You don't get to decide who belongs anywhere. Williams scoffed, taking a step forward, closing the space between them. I'm just making sure everything's in order. Captain, I don't like people who think they can skip the line and get ahead without following the rules. James held his ground, the fire in his chest rising. You're mistaken. I follow the rules, but some of us have to fight harder to get through the door. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of years of struggle. Years of proving himself in a world that always seemed to question his right to exist in spaces where he excelled. He wasn't just a pilot. He wasn't just a man in uniform. He was a testament to resilience, to perseverance, to breaking barriers that others never had to face. For a moment, Williams seemed to hesitate, the mocking smirk faltering, but then, he leaned in, his voice dropping low, and James could hear the venom in his words. You know, you're not special. You think because you're a pilot, you've got it all figured out. But people like you, you're always looking for a way in where you don't belong. You think you're above the rest of us. His voice was thick with contempt. James felt the words hit him, but he didn't let them break him. He had been told worse, by people who didn't matter. He'd spent his life proving people wrong, proving that he belonged wherever he stood. No matter what they thought of him. I don't need your validation, officer, James said quietly, his voice firm. I've been flying for 20 years. I've earned every hour, every flight, every respect I get. But you don't get to define me. Not anymore. The officer's face darkened, his earlier smugness replaced by something else, a flicker of uncertainty. A realization that maybe, just maybe, he had underestimated the man in front of him. The crowd, sensing the shift, began murmuring in agreement, some nodding, others staring openly at Officer Williams. They had seen what had happened. They had witnessed the prejudice, the assumptions, and now, as the power shifted in the conversation, it was clear who was in the right. Williams stepped back, his shoulders stiff with frustration. He glanced around, seeing the looks from the growing group of passengers who had gathered to witness the showdown. He realized, too late, that he had lost the battle. Fine, Williams muttered, his voice edged with bitterness. I'll let you have your little victory, Captain, but don't think for a second this is over. James stood tall, his voice unwavering. It's over, officer. You just haven't realized it yet. As the officer stalked off, his face flushed with frustration, James felt the weight of the moment lift. The passengers who had been watching nodded in approval, some even offering silent words of encouragement as they passed by. Ethan approached, his expression one of quiet admiration. Well handled, Captain. James nodded, the adrenaline slowly beginning to fade. It wasn't a victory of pride or ego. It was a victory of dignity, of standing firm in the face of adversity, and refusing to let anyone strip away his worth. The fight wasn't over, but for today, James Lawson had reclaimed his respect. And that, he thought, was enough. The tension that had been so palpable just moments ago began to dissipate as James Lawson watched Officer Ryan Williams retreat through the terminal. The crowd, which had gathered to witness the confrontation, was slowly breaking apart, but not without leaving behind an air of palpable change. James could feel their eyes on him, some curious, others full of silent support. In that brief, fleeting moment, he realized something. It wasn't just about him anymore. It wasn't just about proving himself to one man who questioned his worth. This was about something bigger. The whispers started slowly, first one voice, then another, and soon, the entire space around him seemed to hum with a quiet solidarity. He didn't have to turn to know that the passengers who had been watching had seen what had happened. They had seen Officer Williams's prejudice, his assumptions, his refusal to listen to the truth. They had seen the way James stood tall, despite it all, refusing to let anyone diminish his worth. As James took a deep breath, letting the calm of the moment settle into his chest, he realized that his fight wasn't just for himself, it was for anyone who had ever been made to feel that they didn't belong. He wasn't the first to face this kind of discrimination, nor would he be the last. But for today, at least, he had taken a stand, and the power had shifted. Ethan Harper, his co-pilot, stepped forward, his expression neutral but with a glimmer of something deeper: respect. Maybe, or admiration. "You all right, Captain?" he asked, his voice soft, as if the energy of the confrontation had left him a little shaken too. James met his co-pilot's gaze and nodded. "Yeah, I'm good. Just, never easy, you know?" He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Ethan smiled sympathetically. "I get it, but you did good. You handled it with a level of control I don't think most people could have managed." James appreciated the words, but he didn't feel victorious, not in the way he thought he would. There was no grand sense of triumph or a swell of pride. Instead, there was a quiet kind of resolve, a knowing that he had done what needed to be done. But there was still something inside him that felt unsettled, like the work wasn't finished. He could feel the weight of the passengers' silent gaze, their expectations. He wasn't just a captain, in that moment. He was a symbol, and symbols carried weight. As the flight attendants began the post-landing checks and passengers stood to gather their things, James felt a tug on his sleeve. He turned to find a young woman standing beside him, her face earnest, her eyes filled with an intensity that made James pause. "Excuse me, Captain Lawson," she said, her voice steady but with a tremor of emotion. I wanted to say thank you." James blinked, surprised by the sincerity in her tone. He'd just been caught in an ugly confrontation, and yet here she was, standing in front of him with nothing but gratitude in her eyes. She glanced around briefly, as if to make sure no one was watching, before continuing. "I saw what happened back there with Officer Williams, and I just wanted to say, I think you did the right thing. People like you don't get enough credit. Not for how hard you work. Not for how much you have to fight just to get a seat at the table. I respect you." James was taken aback. He'd expected anger, maybe, or even a pitying glance. But not this. He felt the weight of her words, like a quiet promise, a recognition that went beyond simple admiration. She wasn't just thanking him for standing up to an officer, she was thanking him for standing up for every person who had ever been made to feel small, invisible. "Thank you," James said, his voice quieter than he intended. "That means more than you know." The woman smiled, her eyes still shining with a quiet but firm resolve. "You're not alone in this," she added before turning back toward the exit, disappearing into the crowd of disembarking passengers. James watched her go, a small knot of emotion tightening in his chest. It wasn't the first time someone had stood up for him, but it was the first time someone had acknowledged what it felt like to live with the weight of prejudice constantly pressing down. The realization that people were willing to stand beside him, willing to speak out, even when it was uncomfortable, was something he hadn't anticipated. But then the whispers turned into something more. As James moved toward the gate, where he'd go through the usual debrief and paperwork, he saw more passengers looking his way, not with pity or curiosity, but with something far more powerful: respect. Their eyes met his, some with subtle nods, others with quiet words of gratitude. It was as though the entire experience had opened something in them, something that hadn't been there before. They had seen the ugly truth, and now, they couldn't unsee it. When James stepped into the terminal, he could feel the shift in the air, the thick, almost electric sense of solidarity. He wasn't just a pilot anymore. He was a man who had refused to let his worth be defined by someone else's assumptions. And in doing so, he had ignited something in others, too. The head flight attendant, Lena Richards, approached him as he gathered his things. "Captain," she said, her voice soft but with an undeniable edge of admiration. "I just wanted to say, you were incredible back there. The way you handled yourself, you don't see that kind of strength every day." James smiled at her, his exhaustion creeping in now that the adrenaline had faded. "It wasn't about strength," he replied. "It was about dignity. And sometimes, dignity is all we have left." Lena nodded, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. Dignity is a good thing to hold onto. As James made his way toward the staff exit, a final glance back at the gate revealed something else. A small crowd of passengers had gathered. Some talking to one another, others looking directly at him with recognition. And in that moment, James knew that the confrontation had become something far bigger than he could have imagined. It wasn't just about one man's prejudice or one officer's assumptions. It was about the change that began when people decided to see one another. Truly see one another, beyond the labels and the prejudices. James stepped into the quiet of the staff exit, feeling a deep, quiet sense of pride settle within him. He wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. But for today, he had made a difference. And that was enough to keep him going. As he walked out into the Los Angeles evening, the cool breeze brushing against his face, James felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Maybe, just maybe, things were starting to change. The glow of the Los Angeles skyline twinkled in the distance as James Lawson sat quietly in his hotel room, the weight of the day settling heavily around him. He had barely eaten, barely slept, and now, after the dust had settled, he found himself staring out the window, lost in thought. It had been hours since the confrontation with Officer Ryan Williams, yet the images of that moment were still fresh in his mind. The officer's scorn, the mockery in his voice, the weight of the crowd's judgment, it all seemed to swirl in his mind like a storm that hadn't quite passed. But amidst it all, there had been something else. The voices of support from the passengers, the gratitude of the young woman who had approached him, the silent nods of respect that followed him through the terminal, the recognition. It was overwhelming. In a way, James had spent so long fighting for respect, battling assumptions about who he was and where he belonged, that he had never allowed himself to feel this sense of validation, of acknowledgement. He didn't know how to handle it. For years, he had taught himself to keep his emotions in check, to compartmentalize his anger, his hurt, his frustration. The cockpit had always been his sanctuary, a place where his skill was unquestioned. But outside of it, in the world that often seemed to look at him as less than, it was a constant battle. A battle to prove that he belonged, to prove that he was worth more than the assumptions others had of him. But that moment at the gate, it had shaken him. For the first time in a long while, he had truly felt seen, truly recognized. It was humbling, and it made him realize something. He was tired. Tired of fighting for respect. Tired of having to earn his place every day. Tired of always being the one who had to prove himself. The reflection in the window was his own. But somehow, tonight, it felt like he was staring at someone else. A man who had walked through life wearing his dignity like armor, but whose armor had started to feel heavier with every passing year. He had carried that weight alone for so long. And yet, now, with the support of strangers, with the quiet strength of those around him, it felt like he might not have to carry it alone anymore. He turned away from the window, pushing his thoughts aside. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for tonight, there was a strange kind of peace. A silence that settled in the space between his ribs. It wasn't a victory in the traditional sense. But it was something. And that something, whatever it was, felt like a shift. A quiet acknowledgement that perhaps, just perhaps, he had already won. His phone buzzed on the table beside him. He picked it up without thinking, seeing a message from Lena Richards, the flight attendant who had spoken up for him earlier that day. "Captain, I just wanted to say again how proud I am of you. You were a true example of strength and dignity today. I hope you know you're not alone in this." James smiled softly, his fingers hovering over the screen as he typed a reply. "Thanks, Lena. I appreciate it more than you know. Today was tough, but it was worth it. We all have to fight for what's right. And sometimes, it just takes one person to start." He hit send, his thoughts lingering on her words. You're not alone in this. He wasn't used to hearing that. Not in a world where he had so often felt isolated. But for the first time in a long while, the idea that he wasn't alone, truly not alone, felt like a lifeline. The soft knock on the door broke his reverie. He stood up, his tired legs protesting the movement. But he walked toward it anyway. When he opened the door, he was surprised to see a familiar face. Ethan Harper. His co-pilot. "Hey, Captain," Ethan said with a small smile. "Mind if I come in for a minute?" "Not at all," James replied, stepping aside to let him in. "What's up?" Ethan sat down on the edge of the bed, his expression serious. "I just wanted to check in. I know today was a lot. And I can't help but feel like there's more going on in your head than you're letting on." James didn't immediately answer. He sat down in the chair by the desk, running a hand through his hair, trying to find the words. It's been a long road, Ethan, a long fight, and sometimes, I wonder if it's worth it. If it'll ever get easier. Ethan's eyes softened with understanding. "I get it. Hell, I've seen it in you for years. The way you handle everything. But here's the thing, James, what happened today, it wasn't just a victory for you. It was a victory for everyone who's been overlooked, underappreciated, or dismissed. And you didn't just stand up for yourself. You stood up for all of us." James looked up, meeting Ethan's gaze. There was sincerity in his eyes. Something that James hadn't seen in a long time from anyone who wasn't a close friend or family. "I didn't do it for the applause," James replied, his voice quiet. "I did it because I'm tired. Tired of having to prove that I belong. That I've earned my place. And if I can't make people see that, then what's the point?" "The point," Ethan said, his voice firm, "is that you're not just earning your place, James. You've earned it every day for the last 2 decades. The point is that this fight, it's not just about you. It's about everyone who's watching. Everyone who feels like they don't have a voice. And today, you gave them a voice. You showed them that they matter." James was silent for a long moment, processing Ethan's words. They felt like a weight being lifted off his shoulders. One he hadn't realized he was carrying until it was gone. "Thanks, man," James said quietly, the exhaustion creeping into his voice. "I needed to hear that." Ethan stood up, clapping him on the back. "Anytime, Captain. Just remember, you're not alone in this fight." As Ethan left the room, James sank back into the chair, his eyes closing as he let the quiet wash over him. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't standing on the edge of a cliff, fighting against an invisible tide. He wasn't alone, and maybe, just maybe, that made all the difference. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to face, new prejudices to fight, but tonight, James Lawson had something he hadn't had in years: peace. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough. The city of Los Angeles was quiet under the veil of night, the lights of the skyline flickering like distant stars. But for James Lawson, sleep seemed a distant possibility. His mind replayed the events of the day, the confrontation, the support from the passengers, the quiet solidarity that had settled over him like a comforting blanket. And then there were the questions. What next? He had stood up for himself, for what he believed in. But the weight of that action seemed to be growing heavier the more he thought about it. He had changed something today. But what would the consequences be? The air in his hotel room felt thick, his thoughts swirling in every direction, until the soft buzz of his phone broke through the noise. It was a message from Lena Richards, the flight attendant who had spoken out on his behalf. He opened the text, finding a simple but powerful note. "Captain, I hope you're okay after everything. I wanted you to know that your actions today didn't go unnoticed. A lot of passengers have been talking about it, and some of them are saying they'll make sure to reach out to the airline. You made a difference today. You gave us a voice." James stared at the message for a long moment, the weight of Lena's words sinking deep into him. A voice. That was what it had felt like. Like he wasn't just fighting for himself anymore, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, ignored, or dismissed. But what did that mean for the future? How long would this ripple effect last? How much of it would be remembered? His phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from his airline's public relations department. And it wasn't what he had expected. It was a formal statement. But the words struck him like a bolt from the blue. Captain Lawson, we've been made aware of the incident earlier today. We appreciate your professionalism and your commitment to the safety and well-being of our passengers. However, in light of recent events, we feel it would be best for all parties if you took a leave of absence for a brief period to allow for a full review of the situation. We want to ensure that no one's reputation is adversely affected, including yours. James's heart dropped as he read the message. A leave of absence? The words echoed in his mind, reverberating with an icy finality. He had always known that his actions, his words, would have consequences. But this? He never imagined the airline would take such a drastic step. A full review of the situation. It felt like a brush off. A way to silence him. His fight had been for respect. But now it seemed he was being punished for standing up. Frustration rose in his chest as he set the phone down. He had done the right thing. Hadn't he? He had shown everyone, passengers, colleagues, even the officer, that he would not be intimidated. That dignity, respect, and hard-earned authority could not be stripped away by prejudice or assumptions. And yet, here he was, being asked to take a step back. How could they do this? James thought bitterly. How could they support me 1 minute and throw me aside the next? But as quickly as his anger flared, it was replaced by something else. A quiet clarity. He wasn't going to let this moment be the end of his story. If the airline wanted to sideline him, then so be it, but they couldn't silence him. Not anymore. Just then, there was a knock at the door. James hesitated, his hand still on the phone, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He stood up, opening the door to find Ethan standing there, his expression unreadable. "Can I come in?" Ethan asked, his voice gentle but firm. James stepped aside, letting his co-pilot enter. Ethan glanced at him, the seriousness in his eyes impossible to miss. "I just read the message from the airline," Ethan said, sitting down across from James. "And I know this is hard to process. But I think we need to talk about what happens next." James nodded slowly, sinking into the chair again, the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. "I never thought it would come to this. I thought they'd support me. But now it feels like they're trying to punish me for doing the right thing." Ethan leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "It's not punishment, James. It's them trying to manage the fallout. They're scared, trying to protect the company's image. But you've made an impact today. People are talking. That's not something they can ignore." James let out a breath, his frustration boiling to the surface. "I didn't do this for them. I didn't do it for the airline. I did it because I'm tired of being treated like I'm less than. I'm tired of proving myself every single day." "I get it," Ethan said, his voice softer now. "I do. But this isn't just about you anymore. It's about what your actions represent. People are seeing you, seeing what you stand for. And they're inspired. This isn't over, James. You've started something that can't be undone." James stared at Ethan for a long time, the words sinking into him slowly. Started something that can't be undone. He hadn't thought about it that way before. All he had wanted was to regain his dignity, to stand up to someone who had assumed he didn't belong. But maybe it had become more than that. Maybe, in the act of standing his ground, he had sparked something else, a conversation, a movement, a ripple that had the potential to spread. Just then, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email from a well-known reporter from a major news outlet. "Captain Lawson, we've been following the incident at Logan International, and we would like to interview you for an exclusive story on the treatment of minorities in high-authority roles. We believe your experience is one that will resonate with our readers. And we want to give you the platform to share your story." The email hung in the air between them, a stark contrast to the cold, formal message from his airline. James stared at it, the weight of the offer sinking in. This was a chance to tell his side of the story, a chance to make the voices of those who had been silenced heard. Ethan watched him carefully. "You don't have to decide right now. But I think it's time for you to take control of this. You've been given a platform, whether you want it or not. What you do with it is up to you." James felt the stirrings of something deep within him. A platform, a chance to speak, to make the world hear what he had been carrying inside for so long. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And now, with the support of those who had seen his struggle, he had a choice. He typed a quick response to the reporter. "I'll do the interview." As he sent the email, a sense of purpose settled over him. This was just the beginning. The ripple he had started would only grow stronger. And he would be at the center of it, fighting not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed. The next chapter had already begun, and James Lawson was ready to face it head-on. The morning sunlight poured through the blinds of James's hotel room, casting long shadows across the floor. He hadn't slept much, his mind racing with the magnitude of the decision he'd made last night. The email he'd sent to the reporter had been a quiet declaration of intent. He was no longer willing to let others define his story. Today, his voice would be heard. The interview was scheduled for noon. The reporter, a woman named Clara Matthews, had been insistent that James share his perspective, that his story was one worth telling. James wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew that this moment was his. It was the opportunity to take control of the narrative, to stand firm and speak his truth to anyone who was willing to listen. He ran his fingers through his hair, the reality of the situation sinking in. He'd fought for respect in every corner of his life. But this was different. This was no longer just about Officer Williams. This was about everything he'd endured to get to this point. The assumptions, the prejudice, the constant battle to prove that he belonged. James paced across the room, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He thought of the many times he had been questioned his worth, his authority, his place in the sky. Today, he wasn't just a pilot. Today, he was a voice for everyone who had ever felt invisible, dismissed, or unjustly judged. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He opened it to find Clara Matthews standing there, her notepad in hand, a calm and professional demeanor about her. She was a little younger than him, but her sharp gaze and confident stance spoke volumes about her experience. She had been in this business long enough to know how to approach someone like James. But there was no denying that the story she was about to write could be a turning point for both of them. "Captain Lawson?" she asked, extending her hand with a polite but genuine smile. "Clara Matthews, thank you for agreeing to speak with me." James shook her hand, feeling the firmness of her grip, the subtle strength that matched her no-nonsense attitude. "It's good to finally meet you. Let's get started." She gestured for him to sit down at the small table near the window. A cup of coffee sat untouched on the corner of the table. And Clara sat across from him, her eyes never leaving his face as she clicked her pen and adjusted her notes. "I'm sure you've heard all kinds of questions about what happened yesterday," Clara began, her voice steady but inquisitive. "But I want to start with you. What was going through your mind when Officer Williams first approached you in the airport?" James took a deep breath, the weight of the memory still fresh. "I've been in this position before, questioned, doubted, dismissed. But there was something different about this encounter. It wasn't just about me being a captain or about my credentials. It was about the assumption that I didn't belong, that I wasn't worthy of being there, of having earned my place in that space. And that's something I'm not willing to accept anymore." Clara nodded, scribbling quickly on her notepad. "It's clear you were deeply affected by the interaction. But why speak out now? Why take this to the public?" James's gaze hardened, the edge of determination sharpening his words. "Because it's not just about me. It's about everyone who's been made to feel like they're less than. Like they don't belong in the spaces they've worked for, earned, and fought to be in. I'm tired of the world telling people like me that we don't deserve to be here. That our hard work isn't enough. We deserve to be seen, to be respected, no matter what our skin color is or where we come from. And if I can help make that change, then I have to speak up." The silence between them felt heavy, but Clara didn't break it. She was listening, really listening, as if she understood the weight behind every word James had spoken. After a moment, she flipped her notepad closed and met his eyes directly. "I can see how much this has impacted you," Clara said quietly. "But you mentioned change. Do you think this moment will lead to that change? Can one person really make a difference in a system that's so ingrained?" James leaned back in his chair, his fingers curling around the edge of the table. He thought about the passengers who had supported him yesterday, the young woman who had thanked him, The looks of respect that had followed him through the terminal. They had seen the truth. They had seen his humanity. His struggle. And for once, they hadn't looked away. I believe change starts with a single moment, he replied, his voice firm. A single act of standing up and saying, no more. It's not about changing the whole world in one day, but about sparking a conversation. About making people think, question, and maybe even change their own actions. If I can be a part of that shift, then I'm willing to take that step. Clara's expression softened, and she put her pen down. You know, I've interviewed a lot of people, but not many have your clarity. Captain, your story isn't just about race, it's about resilience. It's about the power of standing up, even when the odds are stacked against you. James felt a small flicker of something pride. Maybe, or a quiet sense of accomplishment. He wasn't doing this for recognition, but hearing Clara's words made him feel like the battle he had fought for so many years was starting to be acknowledged. It was about more than just yesterday's incident. It was about everything that had come before it. All the quiet fights he had fought and won on his own. You're not alone in this fight, Clara added, her voice quieter now. There are people who will support you. You've already proven that, and I think your story will resonate with a lot of people. This is bigger than just one person, it's a movement. James met her eyes, his chest swelling with a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about an interview, about a single moment in time. It was about the future. About the work that needed to be done. The conversations that needed to happen. And maybe, just maybe, this was the first step in a long, difficult journey toward true equality. Clara closed her notepad and stood up, offering her hand again. Thank you for your time, Captain. I'm honored to have heard your story. And I believe, without a doubt, it will inspire many. James stood as well, shaking her hand firmly. Thank you for giving me the platform to share it. As Clara left the room, James stood at the window, watching the city stretch out beneath him. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the skyline. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. His fight wasn't over, but this moment, this conversation had changed something. It had started something that would ripple out and reach more people than he could ever have imagined. James Lawson wasn't just a pilot anymore. He was a symbol of what it meant to fight for respect. To fight for your place in the world. And as the night fell, he knew the journey ahead would be long. But for the first time, he wasn't alone. And that, he thought, made all the difference.